Happy New Year and welcome to episode 62 of No Rares Required, a weekly podcast where I cover the common and uncommons that make up the majority of cards that you'll see during a draft. And this week is the Simic or green-blue, which I'll call Simic Pivot. That's what won the vote. And as usual, I'll start by going over my draft skeleton, kind of covering the broad strategy for the archetype, and then dive into the cards specifically and when I think you should look to take them in a draft. So Simic's theme is Explore, and I think the problem is that the Explore mechanic is great in every archetype, and there aren't enough synergies specifically within Simic to make Explore shine even better. So in a set that really rewards having synergies, it makes it kind of difficult. Not only are other archetypes picking up your Explore cards because they work just as fine in that archetype, but yeah, there's nothing that's really giving you a huge payoff for doing it specifically in Simic. So at the time of this recording, it has the third worst win rate on 17 lands, and unlike Orsov and Rakdos, or white-black and red-black, the two archetypes that have a worse win rate on 17 lands, it isn't because Simic has trap cards. there aren't cards that are just dramatically being overdrafted that are not great, like Acolyte of Akhlazotz or like the Skull Taker in black. However, there is one thing that Simic has going for it, and I've found that it is a decent space to pivot during a draft if you get cut out of one of your colors, since both the blue half is cards that you would use commonly in Izzet and Azorius artifacts, and then the green half is something that you would use in like red-green dinos. So if you start off in one and you need to pivot into the other, you kind of can make it this weird conglomeration of decent green and blue cards. Now, there is an Explore strategy, and there are a few Explore payoffs that I'll cover specifically if you open up like Deep Fathom Echo and pack one, pick one, and really want to try to make the Explore Simic thing happen from the get-go. But because the archetype's theme kind of got hijacked in a set that really cares about synergies, I do think it's generally better as a backup plan. As you'll see, a lot of the cards that I'm going to cover are just like better in a different archetype because they synergize with other cards. Either way, remember to hit like and subscribe for near daily Magic the Gathering content. Come visit YouTube to place a vote for the next week's archetype. And with that, let's dive into the cards individually and when you should look to take them in a draft. So first, I like to calculate the total wins created, and I do this by taking the average of the games played win rate and the games in hand win rate on 17 lands, which is a website that tracks Magic the Gathering data. And then I subtract the average win rate of all of the users in the archetype specifically and multiply it by the number of games played. And what this does is allows me to isolate in the data what are the cards that are most commonly being played, that are most positively influencing the archetype. And so we've got Waterwind Scout, which is a top-performing blue common. It's the 2/2 flyer for 3 that spawns a map token. Spyglass Siren, which is the 1/1 flyer for 1 blue that spawns a map token. Plotly's Final Strike, which is the fight spell in green. Deep Fathom Echo, which is the signpost rare. We'll cover it shortly. Pathfinding Axejaw, which is the 4/3 for 4 in green that explores. Cenote Scout, which is the 1/1 for 1 green that explores. Sentinel of the Nameless City, which is the 3/4 that creates a map token, and then every time it attacks, it creates another map token. So you can kind of see there is a sub-theme of Explore cards here. But yeah, we'll get into it in a little bit here. Staggering Size, which is the +3/+3 in Trample. Cogwork Wrestler, which is the artifact that is like a combat trick. It's a 1/2 that gives target creature -2/-0. And we've got Poison Dart Frog, which is the 1/1 mana dork that has reach and can give itself Death Touch for 2 colorless. Zoetic Glyph, which turns an artifact into a 5/4 that triggers a Discover 3 when it goes to the graveyard. Kitesail Larcenist, which is a 2/3 flyer with Ward 1 that turns something into a treasure token. Unlucky Drop, which is the 4-cost, put target creature on top of or bottom of the player's library. Lodestone Needle, which is the tap and put stun counters on for 1 in a blue with flash artifact that then can craft into a thing that taps for 1 colorless and triggers an Explore. Malamet Battleglyph, which is target creatures fight each other, but you get a +1/+1 if it came into the battlefield this turn. And then you have Brackish Blunder, which is the 1 and a blue to bounce something and create a map token if it's tapped. And then conversely, we can kind of look at like what are the cards that are most negatively affecting the archetype. And you can see that there's not a whole lot of cards that are like if you can compare this to black, right? Like when you look at Azorius and when you look at Rakdos, there are some very high wins destroyed cards, and this one is everything's a little bit low, and it just kind of generally is like, you know, cards that are off color splashes. The one exception is Waterlogged Hulk, which is the artifact that can self-mill, that then turns into the 4/4 with Descend 8 that becomes unblockable. And this one, people have been thinking maybe Simic's a decent space to do the Descend 8, and it's not. The Explorer works pretty well to get like to Descend 4, and there is some Descend synergies. But you're going to be really missing the self-mill of Deathcap Marionette and Another Chance in black. So there is a Sultai or blue-green-black Descend space, and this is specifically looking at archetypes that are only 2 colors. So this is what is Simic doing when black is not part of the equation, and it's not doing the Descend thing particularly well. Seeker of Sunlight is the 1/1 for 1 that can tap 2 and a green to explore, which I think people commonly put in because you're just trying to get as many Explore cards as possible. You've got Treasure Map, which is a colorless rare that eventually gives you the ability to draw cards. It's better the longer the game goes. Spelunking, which is specifically for cave synergies. Marauding Brinefang, which is the 7-cost 6/7 ward 3 with island cycling for 2. Sunken Citadel, which is a rare cave land. You've got a Sovereign Akanak Ahau, which is the green-white signpost mythic. Ukbenbach, the Great Mistake, which is the blue-black that has Vigilance and Menace and can come back if you have Descend 8. Basking Capybara, which is the 1/3 that becomes a 4/3 if you have Descend. And Calamitous Cave-In, which take note of this card right here, right? Because at the very end of this, we'll come back to Calamitous Cave-In. But yeah, this is not it's not a particularly good space for the cave strategies, and with an asterisk. And then we've got Malamet Brawler, which as a 2/2 that gives something Grizzly Bear that gives something trample when it attacks. Defossilize, which is the 4 and a black reanimate double explore card. So I think people have been like, maybe we splash Defossilize to get more Explore in the deck. That has not been performing well. Didactic Echo, which is the 3/2 flyer draw card if you've Descended. Master's Guide Mural, which is the spawns a 4/4 for 5 and then can switch into the for 7. It can start pumping out a 4/4 for artifacts, but you need to play an artifact each turn. You can only tap it when an artifact is entered the battlefield. We've got Relic's Roar, which is you can turn an artifact into a 4/3 at instant speed with 1 blue. And then Hunter's Blowgun, which gives you reach and death touch depending on whose turn it is, and it is a colorless artifact equipment with equip cost 2. So going through this list, you can kind of take away a couple of things. Once again, you can see that the set does not splash particularly well. The purple cards are splashes and they're not doing very great. And then you've got like off-color cards like the Calamitous Cave-In and the Defossilize, which kind of fit what you would think would work in the deck, but it hasn't worked very well. And I think largely it's just because the set really struggles with off-color splashes. So, but after that, I like to go into the data a little bit further, and I like to take those wins created and divide them by the number of times that the card was picked, and graph it against the average taken at what point in the draft was the card taken. And then if I fit the data with a logarithmic regression, I can calculate how close the card is to the fitted line. So the further it is, the more of an outlier it is, then the higher the VORP or value over replacement it will be. And this was a technique that was created by Carl, aka 2 Duck Cubed. Thank you, Carl. I appreciate you. And then, so what's nice about this, though, is that you can kind of see what the top cards are to take at different time points within a draft specifically. So top of the list is Sentinel of the Nameless City. You get a 3/4 Vigilance for 3 that when it enters the battlefield or attacks, you create a map token. And it does perform best in Celestia and in Simic, where the +1/+1 off of the map tokens are the most beneficial. And then you've also got Oger Kaslam, Deepest Growth, which is the legendary green god that turns into a land that you can transform back into the green god if you control 10 or more permanents. So it works really well if you're flooding the board with a bunch of like 1/1s and map tokens. It performs best in Celestia and Simic, which I have a lot of similarities. They're both kind of doing this creature power. Because Explorer gives you a +1/+1 counter when you flip over a non-land card, you kind of get the same +1/+1 counters theme that you do in Celestia in Simic as well. And so, if the set was better at splashing, I do think you would actually see a Bant counters space. But we've also got Kite Sail Larcenist, which there's nothing spectacular about it in Simic specifically, but it is an amazing bomb in any blue deck. Easy inclusion. We've got Jadelight Spelunker, which, funny enough, actually performs best in Golgari, but its second best performing archetype is Simic. And the reason why it's really good in Golgari is because you can either make it into a really big late game threat, or you can use it to just descend. Right, so like all of the non-land cards, if you just surveil them into the graveyard, it's a really great way to enable your Golgari descend and like get stuff that you want to reanimate cheaply with Defossilize into the graveyard. In Simic, you're more likely just leaning on the slight little bit of Explore synergies. We've got Pugnacious Hammerskull, which is a great green bomb, best in Gruul because of the Dino package. But the majority of the dinosaur package is actually within green. So Pugnacious Hammerskull, as long as you pick up other dinosaurs in green, it can be relatively self-contained in any green deck. And then we've got Bedrock Tortoise. Oh, sorry, excuse me. We've got Bedrock Tortoise, which is best in Celestia because of its synergies with like Kutzil, the Signpost Uncommon, and Green-White. But it does work well in Simic too, because your primary interaction in green-blue is kind of limited to Huatli's Final Strike. So having Hexproof to protect yourself from the getting 2-for-1 by your opponent's removal synergizes nicely. And now we get into like the juicy bit of the podcast, right? And like this is the one that is usually the most useful information, I think, for drafts specifically, because this picks 2.5 through 5 are what are your really important commons and your uncommons that are going to kind of push you into that archetype. So top of the list, we've got Deep Fathom Echo, and no surprise here, the Simic Signpost rare is actually best in Simic. You get a 4/4 that at the beginning of your combat you explore, and then you can have it become a copy of a creature that you control until end of turn. But you just get a recurring Explorer trigger, which if you do have enough Explorer, you can synergize with it with a couple of the other cards that we're going to cover here. Cenote Scout, which is a 1/1 for 1 that triggers an Explore. It's best in Gruul and in Simic, both because both of them have a limited amount of good 2-drops because of like the Malamet Brawler not being particularly good and Baskin Capybara. Green in general just really likes the Cenote Scout for that early interaction, unless you're in a color pair that gives you other early drops that are good and beneficial. So the Cenote Scout is particularly good for that reason, as well as if you do have enough Explore synergies, you can just pick up anything that has the keyword Explore sometimes and make a deck that synergizes okay. Malamet Battleglyph, where the creatures fight each other, and if you get a +1/+1 counter if the creature came in this turn, works particularly nice in Simic because Simic blue doesn't have a lot of really good spot removal, so you have to lean heavily on the green spot removal. And we've got Spyglass Siren, which Simic is its worst archetype, and which says a lot, right? So if, the 1/1 flyer that creates the map token triggers Explore specifically. And it's still, if you look at the like game in hand win rate on 17 lands, Spyglass Siren is lowest of all of the blue archetypes in Simic specifically. But it's still a great card, and it's great in every blue deck. Similarly with Waterwind Scout, it's just a powerful blue common that performs about the same in every blue archetype. the map token doesn't work better in Simic. And I think that's, like I said earlier, is the biggest problem with the archetype, is that the Explorer synergies don't work better than they do in other archetypes. And then we've got Lodestone Needle, which is the 1/2 flash artifact that when it enters, you can tap something and put 2 stun counters on it. So it's better in Izzet, worst in Dimir. Basically, the slower that your deck's plan is, and I think Dimir is probably one of the slowest, or at least it can be. If you go back, there is a way to make Dimir tempo, but I think typically people take it into a descend control space. But either way, the Lodestone Needle is better the more tempo based you are, like the Izzet Pirate deck. The longer that the game goes on, then the more likely that target that you're removed is actually going to become relevant again. And the being able to craft into the Guidestone Compass, which does give you the ability to trigger an Explorer for 1 colorless every turn, if you activate it as a sorcery. It does, like I said, just like the other Explore stuff, doesn't work noticeably better in an archetype that should really care about the Explorer synergies. So the Guidestone Compass is nice. I've enjoyed crafting it, but there's nothing spectacular about it in Simic specifically. And then like Thrashing Brontodon, Simic is also its worst archetype. So Golgari is actually its best because of being able to recur the Thrashing Brontodon and get additional sacrifices off of it again. Or Gruul because of Dino synergies, and you get a 3/4 Dino that can destroy problematic artifacts or enchantments in the set. But like Simic is, like I said, it's a decent enough pivot space, and I think a lot of people do that as well, where you start out green dinos, but then the red's not quite there, or you're trying to reach for some playables, and you can kind of take advantage of some early blue, or vice versa. You start out in blue and you can pick up green, depending on which one's being undervalued in your draft. And then now we get into the commons and underappreciated uncommons for the VORP pick 5 through 8. And we've got Explorer's Cache, which, like I said earlier, Simic, because of the Explorer, can have a lot of the +1/+1 counters. And whenever a creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it dies, you put a +1/+1 counter on Explorer's Cache. So if you trigger an Explorer, you can actually grow your Explorer's Cache instead of it just being limited to 2 +1/+1 counters, and then you can kind of spread your threats out, and it works really nicely with the Spyglass Sirens and the Waterwind Scout to just kind of up them a little bit, kind of like you do in Celestia with the Miner's Guidewing and the Ultec Cloud Guard. Giving the +1/+1 counters works particularly well with flyers. And then we've got the Huatli's Final Strike, which you need to pick up in Simic because you don't have very good spot interaction in Simic. Jade Seedstones, which works best in Golgari because you're more likely to have big green beef in the graveyard, but it works quite nicely with the Explorer's Cache anytime that you care about the +1/+1 counters. And then we've got Pathfinding Axedraw, and this is kind of what I mean by like they missed the mark a little bit. You get a 4/3 dinosaur that when it enters the battlefield it explores. If Simic was achieving its goal, then any card that had the keyword Explore should be doing at least marginally better in Simic than in other archetypes. Pathfinding Axedraw's worst archetype is Simic. It performs better in every green archetype. Dinosaurs for Gruul for the dinosaur synergies. The +1/+1 counter works better in Celestia by increasing the base power. Golgari just likes the really big threat and additional dinosaur synergies. So like, and the fact that you can like descend into your graveyard with Explorer. So like, it's just like you can tell that they missed the mark a little bit with Simic, and we'll get to why in just a second here. Cogburger Wrestler works surprisingly well in Simic. Similar to Izzet, if you've got a kind of if you look at the draft skeleton at the beginning of the video, I'm kind of topping off at 4, nothing more than 4 as a mana value, and so you which is very similar to Izzet. There's a lot of Izzet builds that I have that also top off at 4 and don't play cards after that. Kind of like Unlucky Drop is your most expensive thing. So you can kind of achieve the same thing in Simic. And Cogwork Wrestler works really well if you're turning your dude sideways and you need to win those combat fights. Works a little bit less if you're It works a little bit better, I should say. So in Is It, if you have because of having more artifact synergies and being able to pair this with like the Captain Storm giving a +1/+1 when this enters the battlefield sort of thing. But it is surprisingly good in Simic. And then we've got Council of Echoes, which, similar to Dimir, Explorer can be a good enabler for Descend 4. And the Council of Echoes plays a lot like Soaring Sandwing. So if you're looking at it like, if you compare it to green-white, you can actually play the Council of Echoes decently in replacing of like in place of the Soaring Sandwing, because if you have the Descend 4, then it's a 4/4 flyer with like a built-in Brackish Blunder, and it plays actually okay. So this is one that, like, if I'm in Simic and I have enough Explorer, I feel pretty good that I'll be able to get the Descend 4 turned on, and then this is like decent top end. I would rather be looking a little bit shorter, like I said, capping off on 4. Another one that's really good is Armored Kincaller. It's not spectacular in Simic. It's best in Gruul because of Dino synergies, but it's a pretty good 3-drop, and the dinosaurs, like I said, are somewhat contained in green, so you can have, 5 or 7 like armored, 5 or 7 dinosaurs, and then Armored Kincaller at least some of the time gives you that like 3 life, whereas in Gruul you're pretty much always going to hit it. And then we've got Poison Dart Frog, which is really great in just every green archetype. A mana dork that then turns into a relevant blocker later in the game is fantastic. You can tap it to give you the 1 mana to pay for its Death Touch, so you really only need to have 1 mana untapped and the frog untapped to be able to make this into a Death Touch blocker with reach, which has been really relevant. It is worse. The worst archetype is Simic, just because Simic is struggling this set. And then similarly, Inverted Iceberg. This is another one that's just been a really good blue card, and if you were in blue and then you're pivoting into the Simic space, I think is a lot of times why you end up with the Inverted Iceberg, because the one problem with the Inverted Iceberg is that you don't have a whole lot of artifacts to craft with. So like, this is a reason to lean a little bit more into those Cogwork Wrestlers and try to get your artifact count up, because green is not giving you a whole lot of artifacts. And then this is the problem. This is the card that caused the whole thing to fall apart. And this is Nickenzill, Current Conductor. It's a fine card. It's not bad, right? Like, especially if you have a whole bunch of Explore payoffs. I've been absolutely buried by the Current Conductor. Nickenzill, so if you Explore, it gets a +1/+1 counter anytime that your creature explores and gets a +1/+1 counter. If the creature explores and hits a land, then you can put that land from your hand onto the battlefield tapped. So it like increases your explorers and like the efficacy of your explorers, and so your explorers either can give you like +2/+2 counters each time, or instead of the card going into your hand, it goes into the battlefield tapped. And like, this should make the explorer synergy better, right? The problem is that it's just not quite good enough. Being able to, the land entering the battlefield tapped instead of your hand, the +1/+1 counter instead of like a double Explorer or something like that. It just doesn't have quite enough power for it to really boost all of the Explorer cards in your deck up to be kind of relevant. And then the last one here is Twists and Turns, and this is the same thing. Like, the Twists and Turns works about, it's filler-ish, like slightly above filler in a lot of archetypes, and the worst archetype is Simic, because it just, yeah, like the Explorer doesn't work better in Simic than it does in other archetypes. And then, so like, I'm driving this point home, right? Like, Simic missed the mark a little bit in the set, and the Twists and Turns, it does work better if you have more Explorer. It does improve your ability to actually get the +1/+1 counters instead of the land draw. And then you can, when you get to 7 lands, turn it into a way to dig for additional threats. It's not bad. I'm not going to be unhappy to have it. And then last here, we've got the value over replacement for picks 8 and onward. And, what's interesting about this is if you look at, like, the lower the win rate in an archetype is, generally the more stuff that you're going to have at picks 8+, right? Like, Orsov was like a list. It was like 17 cards or whatever, right? What's interesting about Simic is that it has a low win rate, but it also doesn't really take advantage of underdrafted cards, because it's made up of the good green cards and the good blue cards of other archetypes. It's not really taking advantage of any of the green and blue cards specifically. other than the ones that you would just normally be doing. So like Staggering Size. If you're in green, Staggering Size is an underdrafted card that does really well. Similar to Gruul, it works really well with big dinos to push damage and is a great win condition or finisher. The one exception is Merfolk Cave Diver, and this is, in my opinion, the Simic secret weapon. You don't often see uncommons make it to pick 8, and when you do, it's something that you can take advantage of as long as the card is somewhat functional. And Merfolk Cave Diver is the one reason to like lean heavily into making everything into your deck explore, because if you can attack in with a 3/4 unblockable creature every single turn that you can make bigger with additional explores, this card can win you games. You just need a critical amount of explorer to actually make it work, which can be problematic because other archetypes care about picking up the explore cards. But sometimes it's there, and I certainly have played against opponents that have a metric ton of explore. And then Unlucky Drop is a card that I want to take a moment and geek out about this because it's just something I've been thinking about a lot this set. So some people are really down on Unlucky Drop because of the negative improvement rate when drawn. And the negative improvement rate when drawn is calculated by taking the games in hand win rate and subtracting it by the games not drawn win rate. So if you have a negative improvement when drawn, on average, the deck performs better when the card is not drawn. And Unlucky Drop has been one of these one of these cards from the get-go. So, some people are like, well, maybe it's just piggybacking on the other archetypes like win rate. Like if you look like in Is It, for example, Unlucky Drop was, people were looking at it because it had a high game in hand win rate, but it had a negative improvement rate when drawn. And it's less than 1 percentage point now. It was more at the beginning of the set. So at this point, it might just be noise. If you look at the games drawn, it is a slight increase at 0.4% compared to games not drawn. And I think the biggest problem for cards like Unlucky Drop is it's not great to have in your opening hand. So I don't think that it's necessarily just like piggybacking. I think that the problem is that you'd much rather be deploying a threat on turn 4 or using hard removal. But this is a little bit of I digress a little bit, but interpreting data is always a fun time, at least if you're a weirdo like me. So let me know in the comments below what you think about Unlucky Drop. I think there's an interesting conversation to be had there. I personally still like including 1 or 2 copies in my blue decks since they are available on the wheel. You just don't want to have a whole ton of them because they are bad to have in your opening hand. And similarly, same thing goes for Brackish Blunder. It's in the same boat as Unlucky Drop. Its improvement rate when drawn, though, is slightly positive instead of slightly negative, but it's still not a great card to have in your opening hand for the same reasons as Unlucky Drop. But I do like to include 1 or 2 copies because they're available late. And I think that I have found them to be useful, although at times kind of, if you're bouncing something to delay your opponent, it can be it can be not the solution that you're looking for compared to hard removal. But in a set where you're like, especially if you're doing the Simic tempo thing and you're really pressuring your opponent, then I've liked the Brackish Blunders and the Unlucky Drops. Hidden Cataract is one that you can look to because of So if you're really strictly in the tempo space and you're capping off at 4, the Discover space from the caves is not as good. There is an alternative way to go about Simic, and one of which is to lean more heavily into the cave synergies. And then we've also got the Cavern Stomper, which is the 7/7. Its best archetype is Gruul Dinos because of dinosaur synergies. Its worst archetype is Simic, but you can take advantage that this card goes late. And if you're in Simic, I think something not ideal went on during the draft. And then we've got Hidden Nursery, and last, the Hidden Volcano. And so this is something that I thought was an interesting thing. So Calamitous Cave-In was in the top 16 cards that were causing wins to be destroyed. So it's not a particularly good space for caves. But we see 3 caves make it onto this list that have close to 0 value over replacement, but still slightly positive, which kind of brings up the question: what is Hidden Volcano really enabling you to do? Because it's not the white one, it's not for Bat Colony. And I really think that this is just a slight nod to splashing red for Polani's Hatcher, and potentially getting a little bit of cave synergies off of Benthsaur, or being able to explore with this with the frog. But anyway, kind of an interesting one to, like a head scratcher to leave you with at the end here. So next week I'll be covering another archetype. We have 2 left before the murders at Karlov Manor, which is coming in early February. Remember to hit like and subscribe for more near daily Magic the Gathering content, and place your vote on the next archetype on YouTube. Happy New Year, everybody. Thank you for being part of my community. Good luck with your drafts and your trophies, and thank you all for the support. It has been a wonderful year, and I look forward to what 2024 has to bring. See you next week.